Chapter 1. The First Glimpse. In the town of Willowbridge, nestled between rolling hills and quiet streams, life moved with a gentle rhythm. The air was fragrant with the scent of lavender that grew wild along the roads, and the cobblestone streets, worn from years of footsteps, led to small cottages with ivy-clad walls. One such cottage, perched on the outskirts, belonged to a young woman named Elara. Elara had lived in Willowbridge her entire life. Her days were filled with simplicity, tending to the flower garden behind her home, walking to the nearby market for fresh bread and milk, and watching the sunset from her small porch. She was content, or so she thought, until the day that would change everything began. The morning was cool, the kind that held the promise of warmth later in the day. As the sun stretched over the horizon, Elara stood by the garden, her fingers trailing gently over the petals of the hydrangeas that had bloomed overnight. She found peace in the way nature moved with certainty, how flowers bloomed and withered, always making room for new life. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, into the quiet spaces of her mind, places she rarely ventured beyond. At the edge of the garden, a narrow path led through the woods, winding toward the village. It was the same path Elara had taken every day for years, and yet today, it seemed different, as if the world had shifted slightly while she slept. She picked up her basket, empty except for a single book she had yet to finish, and set off down the familiar trail. The morning light filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with patches of gold. The scent of pine mingled with the earthiness of the soil beneath her feet. She walked slowly, savoring the quiet, her thoughts wandering further than usual. The soft crunch of leaves under her boots was the only sound, a rhythmic echo of her footsteps. As she neared the clearing where the woods met the village square, Elara paused. It was here, just beyond the last curve in the path, that something shifted. She felt it before she saw it, a presence, a change in the air around her. Her heart quickened, though she had no reason to believe anything unusual lay ahead. And then, there he was, standing at the edge of the square, just beyond the village fountain, was a man she had never seen before. His back was to her, his figure outlined by the morning sun. He was tall, with broad shoulders and hair that caught the light like gold. He seemed to be looking at the fountain, his posture calm, his hands resting casually at his sides. Elara slowed her steps, unsure of why her gaze lingered. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the scene, and yet she could not look away. The stranger moved with a certain grace, a quiet strength that seemed to ripple through the stillness of the morning. He took a step forward, his head tilted slightly as if lost in thought, before turning slowly to his left. It was then that Elara saw his face, though it was only for a moment. His features were sharp, yet soft, as though time itself had molded him with care. His eyes, though distant, seemed to hold a depth that both intrigued and unsettled her. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned fully, his eyes locking with hers across the distance. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. The world around them faded, the sounds of the village dulling to a soft hum. It was as though the very earth beneath them held its breath. Elara's heart raced in her chest, a sensation she hadn't felt in years, if ever. She didn't know this man, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. But in that moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the world. She stood frozen, her fingers gripping the handle of her basket. She thought of looking away, of breaking the invisible connection that had formed between them, but her body refused to move. There was something in his gaze, something deep and unspoken, that held her still. The man's expression softened slightly, as if he too had felt the pull of something unknown. He did not move toward her, nor did he turn away. Instead, he simply stood there, his eyes holding hers for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few fleeting moments. Then, Just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. The man blinked, breaking the spell, and with a small nod of his head, he turned and walked toward the other side of the square. Elara remained where she was, her heart still racing, her mind reeling. She watched as he disappeared into the crowd of the bustling market, his figure soon swallowed by the busy village life. Elara stood for a long time after he was gone, the morning sun now fully risen, casting its warmth over her skin. She felt different, though she could not explain why. The world around her was the same. The trees, the path, the square. But something inside her had shifted. Without knowing why, Elara felt a strange certainty that this was not the last time she would see the man. The feeling was both comforting and unnerving, like the first stirrings of a storm on a still day. As she turned to continue her walk into the village, her thoughts were no longer on the flowers she planned to buy or the bread she needed to bake. Instead, they were on the stranger by the fountain, the man whose face she could not forget, and the quiet, powerful moment that had passed between them. The first glimpse had been enough to change everything. Chapter 2. A Stolen Glance. The days that followed Elara's encounter with the stranger felt oddly suspended, as though time had lost its natural course. Life in Willowbridge continued, of course, with its predictable routines and gentle rhythms, but for Elara, something had shifted. There was a new undercurrent in her thoughts, subtle yet undeniable, like a quiet river flowing beneath the surface of her ordinary days. She returned to her garden, tending to the flowers with the same careful touch she always had. The hydrangeas, dahlias, and roses bloomed in abundance, their colors vibrant against the soft green of the leaves. Yet, even here, among the familiar blossoms and the soothing hum of bees, her mind would wander to the man in the village square. She couldn't help it. His image had lodged itself somewhere deep within her, as if the brief glimpse they had shared had opened a door to something she didn't yet understand. It was late afternoon on the third day after their encounter when Elara decided to visit the village again. She hadn't meant to return so soon. After all, she had no need to go back to the market for supplies. Yet the urge to walk the familiar path through the woods tugged at her, an invisible pull that she couldn't resist. It was as though her feet had a will of their own, carrying her towards something unseen. The air was warm that day, filled with the scent of summer flowers and the earthy aroma of the forest floor. As she made her way down the winding path, the sun filtered through the trees in soft, golden rays, casting long shadows across the ground. There was a stillness to the woods, a quiet that seemed to reflect her own internal restlessness. When she reached the edge of the clearing where the woods met the village square, Elara paused once more, just as she had on that first day. She hadn't expected to see him again. Not so soon, and not like this. But there he was. The stranger stood by the fountain, his posture almost the same as before, though this time, he wasn't alone. People moved around him, villagers bustling with their daily tasks, children laughing as they chased each other across the cobblestones, shopkeepers calling out to customers. But he seemed apart from it all, as if he existed in a different rhythm, a slower, quieter one. Elara stayed hidden at the edge of the trees, her heart quickening in her chest. She didn't know what she was waiting for or why she hadn't stepped into the square yet, but something kept her rooted to the spot. From her vantage point, she could observe him without being seen, and there was a strange comfort in that. The stranger's movements were slow and deliberate as he bent down to pick up a stone from the edge of the fountain. He turned it over in his hand, his fingers brushing against its smooth surface before setting it back down. It was such a simple action, yet there was a grace to it, as though even the most mundane tasks carried a weight of meaning for him. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the water as it trickled from the fountain's spout, sparkling in the sunlight. As Elara watched him, she realized that her thoughts were no longer her own. They were filled with questions, with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider before. Who was this man? Why had he appeared so suddenly in Willowbridge, a place where new faces were rare? And why, of all the people in the village, had he seemed to notice her in that brief moment they had shared? It felt as though he carried with him a story, one that was both familiar and foreign, and one that she inexplicably wanted to know. The minutes passed slowly as Elara stood there, half hidden by the trees. The world around her continued in its quiet way. The birds sang from the branches above, the soft breeze rustled the leaves, but all of it seemed distant, as though she was watching from the outside. Her focus remained on the stranger, and though he hadn't looked in her direction, she felt a connection, thin as a thread, stretching between them. Then, as if sensing her presence, he lifted his head. His eyes scanned the square, passing over the villagers, the market stalls, the open doors of the shops, until they settled on the line of trees at the edge of the clearing. On her, Elara's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning away, disappearing back into the woods before he could fully see her. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, just as they had the first time they had locked eyes. She could do nothing but stand there, her gaze meeting his across the distance. There was something different about his expression this time. He seemed less distant, less guarded, as though a veil had lifted, revealing a hint of the person beneath. His eyes, the same deep shade of blue she remembered, softened, and though they were still far apart, Elara felt the intensity of his gaze as if he were standing right beside her. Slowly, he began to move, taking a step toward her. His movements were unhurried, almost tentative, as though he were testing the waters of this strange, silent connection they shared. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, and though her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, she found herself unable to move, unable to break the invisible pull between them. But just as quickly as he had begun to move, something shifted in the square. A child ran by, laughing as she chased after a stray ball, and the stranger paused. The brief interruption was enough to break the moment. He hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the village, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he turned and walked in the opposite direction. Elara stood frozen, watching as he disappeared into the crowd once more, his figure swallowed by the bustling life of the village. The air around her felt heavy, as though the world had returned to its normal pace, leaving her behind. Slowly, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The connection was gone, severed by the distance and the sudden intrusion of reality. But the memory of his gaze, of the quiet intensity they had shared, lingered in the air around her, clinging to her skin like a whisper. She turned and began to walk back through the woods, her thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and anticipation. There was something between them, something unspoken yet undeniable, and though she didn't understand it yet, she knew that this was only the beginning. The stolen glance had been enough to set the course of something deeper, something that neither of them could control. Chapter 3: Beneath the Oak Tree. The days blended into one another as summer reached its peak in Willowbridge. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, while the sun stretched long into the evenings, casting a golden glow over the village. Life moved in its usual, predictable ways. The market filled with the hum of activity, children ran along the winding streets, and villagers went about their business with the same quiet rhythm. But for Elara, the world had taken on a different hue, one marked by a quiet anticipation she didn't fully understand. She hadn't seen the stranger since the second time she glimpsed him by the fountain. Days had passed, and though she walked to the village nearly every morning, each visit was met with the same stillness. He was nowhere to be found, yet his absence only intensified the strange pull she felt. She thought of him often, his figure now a permanent part of her mind, as if her brief encounters with him had woven him into the fabric of her thoughts. It was both unsettling and intoxicating. It was on one of these warm, hazy mornings that Elara found herself drawn away from the village and back to the woods. The path she often took was one she knew well, winding through the trees and leading to a small, secluded meadow that lay just beyond the village borders. It was a quiet place, where the world seemed to slow, and the hum of daily life disappeared, leaving only the sounds of nature. The soft rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds, and the distant trickle of the stream that ran nearby. Elara hadn't intended to go to the meadow that day. She had originally planned to tend to her garden, perhaps finish the book she'd left half-read on her bedside table. But something in the stillness of the morning called to her, and without much thought, she found herself walking along the familiar path, the soft earth cool beneath her feet. The air was fresh beneath the canopy of trees, and as she walked, Elara allowed her thoughts to drift. They returned, as they always did, to the stranger, the man whose presence lingered even in his absence. She thought of the way he had looked at her, the silent connection that had passed between them in those brief moments. There had been no words, no introductions, and yet, she felt as though she had known him for far longer than those fleeting encounters suggested. It was as though their souls had brushed against each other in the quiet spaces between them. The path curved sharply to the right, and as Elara rounded the bend, the meadow came into view. The tall grasses swayed gently in the breeze, dotted with wildflowers of every color. At the far edge of the meadow stood a large oak tree, its wide branches reaching out like arms offering shelter. It was an old tree, one that had stood there for as long as anyone in the village could remember, its roots deeply embedded in the earth. Elara paused for a moment at the edge of the meadow, taking in the sight of the tree and the peaceful scene before her. There was something about this place, about the quiet simplicity of it, that always brought her a sense of calm. She began to walk toward the oak, the grass brushing against her legs as she made her way across the open field. As she neared the tree, her steps slowed. It was then, just as the wide trunk of the oak came into full view, that she saw him. The stranger was sitting beneath the tree, his back against the rough bark, one knee bent while the other leg stretched out before him. His head was tilted slightly upward, his eyes half closed as if lost in thought, the sunlight filtering through the leaves and casting soft patterns of light and shadow over his face. He looked as though he had been there for some time, completely at ease in the stillness of the meadow. Elara stopped, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. For a moment, she thought about turning back, slipping away unnoticed before he realized she was there. But something kept her rooted to the spot, the same invisible pull that had held her still during their previous encounters. She watched him, her breath catching in her throat, wondering if this was all some strange dream, some figment of her imagination. But then, as if sensing her presence once again, the man opened his eyes. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding hers across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to pause, the gentle sway of the grass, the rustle of the leaves, all fading into the background as their eyes locked. There was something different about this moment, something deeper and more profound than the stolen glances they had shared in the village. Here, in the solitude of the meadow, with nothing but the ancient oak to witness, the connection between them felt tangible, as though the air itself vibrated with an unspoken energy. The stranger didn't move, but there was no need for him to. His gaze held hers with such quiet intensity that Elara felt as though he had reached out and touched her. Her heart raced, her pulse quickening, yet she remained still, drawn to him by a force she couldn't explain. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his position, moving to rest both arms on his knees. His eyes softened, the quiet strength that had first caught her attention now tempered with something gentler, something that spoke of understanding. He didn't beckon her forward, didn't make any motion for her to come closer, but there was no need for such gestures. The space between them seemed to shrink, as if the mere act of being in each other's presence closed the distance that lay between them. Elara took a tentative step forward, her feet moving of their own accord. The grass whispered beneath her as she approached, her gaze never leaving his. She didn't know what she was doing, didn't know why she felt compelled to come closer, but it was as though the path had already been laid out for her, and all she had to do was follow it. When she reached the base of the oak, she stopped. The stranger remained still, his eyes following her movements with a quiet intensity that both unsettled and reassured her. For a long moment, they simply stood there, separated by a few feet of grass, the massive tree standing sentinel above them. Elara's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with the weight of unspoken emotions. She wanted to ask him who he was, wanted to understand the strange connection that seemed to bind them together, but the words never came. Instead, she simply sat down, her back resting against the oak tree, mirroring his posture. They sat in silence, the space between them filled with the quiet sounds of nature. The gentle rustling of the leaves, the soft buzz of insects in the grass, the distant call of a bird. The world seemed to slow, as if time itself had bent to the will of the moment, allowing them to exist in this shared stillness. Elara closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the warmth of the sun and the cool shade of the oak wash over her. When she opened them again, she found the stranger still watching her, his expression unreadable but not unkind. There was something in his gaze that spoke of recognition, as if he, too, had felt this pull, this undeniable force that had drawn them together. The hours passed in silence, yet the weight of the moment made it feel timeless. There were no words, no explanations, just the quiet understanding that something had shifted between them. The connection, once tenuous and fleeting, now felt solid, like the roots of the oak that anchored them to this place. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the meadow, Elara stood. The stranger remained seated, watching her as she gathered her basket and turned to leave. She glanced back once, her eyes meeting his one last time before she stepped away, the soft crunch of the grass beneath her fading into the quiet of the evening. Though no words had passed between them, Elara felt as though they had shared something profound, something that didn't require explanation. Beneath the oak tree, in the stillness of the afternoon, they had begun to understand one another in a way that transcended language. And as she made her way back through the woods, the warmth of the stranger's presence stayed with her, a quiet certainty that their paths would cross again. Chapter 4. The Quiet Breeze. The days grew longer as summer reached its zenith, and the warmth of the season wrapped itself around Willowbridge like a soft blanket. The villagers moved about their routines with the slow, easy pace that marked the height of summer. The market square filled with laughter and conversation, the hum of daily life buzzing like bees in a garden. But for Elara, the world had taken on a new quietness, a stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface of things. Ever since her time beneath the oak tree with the stranger, that day in the meadow had left an impression on her, one that lingered long after she had returned home. She hadn't spoken to anyone about it, hadn't shared the strange yet undeniable connection she had felt with the man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. It was as though that moment belonged only to her, a secret she carried like a delicate keepsake, tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. She spent her days as she always had, tending to her flowers, walking through the woods, and visiting the village market. Yet, everything felt different now, colored by the knowledge that the stranger was still out there somewhere, just beyond the edge of her thoughts. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him, but it no longer mattered. His presence, even in its absence, had become a part of her world, something constant and unspoken. It was on one such morning, when the air was thick with the scent of lavender and the soft rustling of leaves, that Elara found herself once again drawn toward the meadow. She hadn't been back to the oak tree since that day, though it had lingered in her mind like a distant melody, one she couldn't quite shake. There was something about the quiet of that place, the stillness that had enveloped them both, that called to her now, as if the meadow itself held some untold secret. The path through the woods was familiar, the same winding trail she had walked countless times before. The sunlight filtered through the trees in soft, golden rays, dappling the forest floor with patches of light. Birds flitted through the branches above, their songs mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. The world around her was calm, peaceful, yet Elara's heart raced with a quiet anticipation she couldn't fully explain. As she neared the edge of the meadow, her steps slowed. She could see the wide expanse of grass stretching out before her, the tall blades swaying gently in the breeze. The oak tree stood at the far end of the field, its branches reaching out like arms, offering shelter and solace. For a moment, Elara stood at the edge of the trees, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight. The meadow was empty, just as it had been the first time she had come here alone. The stranger was not there, but Elara had not expected him to be. And yet, the pull she felt toward this place was undeniable, as though something waited for her beneath the oak tree, something she could not yet name. Slowly, she made her way across the field, the grass brushing against her legs as she walked. The air was warm, but the soft breeze that blew through the meadow carried with it a hint of coolness, a reminder that summer would not last forever. Elara's steps were slow, measured, as if she were walking towards something both known and unknown. When she reached the oak tree, she paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the rough bark. The tree stood as it always had, a silent witness to the passage of time. Elara found herself wondering how many others had sat beneath its branches, how many stories the tree had silently observed over the years. She felt a strange kinship with the oak, as though it too carried the weight of something unspoken. She sat down at the base of the tree, resting her back against its sturdy trunk. The ground beneath her was cool, the grass soft beneath her hands. For a long time, she simply sat there, letting the stillness of the meadow wash over her. The quiet breeze played with the edges of her dress, lifting the fabric in gentle waves, and the sunlight danced across her skin in a pattern of light and shadow. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did these days, to the stranger. She wondered where he was, what he was doing at that very moment. Was he thinking of her, too? Did he feel the same strange pull that she did? The sense that something had been set into motion between them, something they could not yet fully understand? Elara didn't know how long she sat there, lost in thought. The world around her seemed to fade, the sounds of the village, the rustle of the leaves, all blending into a soft hum. The only thing that seemed real was the steady beating of her own heart, the quiet certainty that something was waiting for her, just beyond the horizon. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that she realized she was no longer alone. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly lifted her gaze, her heart racing in her chest. The stranger stood just a few feet away, his figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the oak's branches, but she recognized him immediately. The same quiet strength in his posture, the same calm presence that had captivated her from the very beginning. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence was enough to send a ripple through the air, a subtle shift in the stillness that had enveloped the meadow. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening as she took in the sight of him. There was something about the way he stood, the way his gaze seemed to hold hers across the distance, that spoke of understanding, of recognition. Slowly, without a word, he took a step forward. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he were testing the waters of this strange connection they shared. Elara remained still, her body rooted to the ground, unable to move even if she had wanted to. There was something about his presence, something unspoken yet undeniable, that held her in place. He stopped a few paces away from her, his eyes never leaving hers. The breeze stirred between them, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and earth. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen, some invisible thread to be pulled taut. And then, slowly, he sat down beside her. The movement was so simple, so unassuming, yet it sent a wave of emotion through Elara's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. They sat there, side by side, beneath the shade of the oak tree, the quiet breeze playing with the edges of their clothes. No words passed between them, no gestures or glances exchanged, yet the air around them seemed to hum with the weight of their shared silence. Elara's heart beat steadily, her breath even as she stared out across the meadow, her thoughts swirling like leaves caught in the wind. She didn't need to look at him to know that he was there, that the quiet connection between them had grown stronger with each passing moment. There was no need for words, no need for explanations. The stillness spoke for itself. The hours passed, the sun moving slowly across the sky, casting long shadows over the meadow as the day wore on. Yet time seemed to lose its meaning beneath the oak tree. They could have been there for hours, for days, or perhaps only moments. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them, the unspoken bond that grew stronger with each passing second. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting the meadow in a soft, golden light, Elara finally turned her head, her gaze drifting toward the stranger beside her. He was staring out across the field, his expression calm, peaceful, as though he too felt the weight of the moment. For a long while, they sat like that, side by side, the quiet breeze carrying their thoughts away with it, scattering them like dandelion seeds across the wide expanse of the meadow. And though they said nothing, though no words passed between them, Elara knew, deep in her heart, that something had changed. The quiet breeze had carried with it the promise of something more, something that neither of them could yet fully understand. And beneath the oak tree, in the stillness of the fading day, they waited, together, for whatever came next. Chapter 5. The Distance Between Stars. The days passed quietly after that afternoon beneath the oak tree. The village of Willowbridge continued its peaceful existence, the rhythm of life unchanged by the passing of seasons. Elara moved through her days with the same steadiness that had always marked her, yet something had shifted within her. It was as though a part of her had been stirred awake, something that had lain dormant for so long that she had almost forgotten it existed. Each morning, she would rise with the sun, the light filtering softly through the curtains of her bedroom, casting a golden glow over the wooden floors. She would dress in the same simple manner, her hands moving through the motions of her daily routine with a practiced grace. Yet, beneath the surface, her thoughts constantly wandered back to the stranger, to the quiet moments they had shared in the meadow. She hadn't seen him again since that day beneath the oak tree, but his presence lingered, like a distant star whose light continued to reach her even though the source had moved on. There was no longing in her heart, no restlessness. Instead, there was a quiet certainty, an understanding that they had crossed paths for a reason, and that whatever lay between them would unfold in its own time. The village seemed unaware of the subtle changes within her. The market was the same bustling scene it had always been, filled with the sound of bartering, laughter, and the clinking of coins. Elara moved through the stalls, selecting her usual items with the same care as before. But now she found herself pausing, her eyes drifting to the edges of the crowd, half expecting to see the stranger standing there, watching her from a distance. But he was never there. The path through the woods became her sanctuary in the days that followed. Each afternoon, when the sun hung high in the sky and the air was thick with the warmth of summer, she would walk the familiar trail, the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet the only sound in the quiet forest. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches forming a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight into soft patches of light on the forest floor. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies blending with the gentle rustling of the leaves, creating a symphony that filled the stillness. Elara would walk for hours, her thoughts drifting like the clouds overhead. She often found herself thinking of the stranger, of the way his presence had filled the space between them without a single word being spoken. There had been something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name, that had mirrored the quiet yearning she had felt in her own heart. It wasn't a yearning for companionship, nor for love in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of understanding. On one such afternoon, as she walked the path through the woods, Elara found herself drawn once again to the meadow. The pull was subtle, like a soft tug at the edges of her consciousness, urging her to return to the place where she had first encountered the stranger. She hadn't intended to go back, had thought perhaps it was best to let the memory of that day remain untouched, but something in the stillness of the afternoon called to her, and she found her feet turning toward the familiar path. The meadow appeared before her like a secret, hidden world. The tall grasses swayed gently in the breeze, their golden heads brushing against one another in a soft whisper. The wildflowers, vibrant in their summer bloom, dotted the landscape with bursts of color, deep purples, bright yellows, and soft blues. The oak tree stood at the far end of the field, its wide branches stretching out like a protective embrace over the earth below. Elara paused at the edge of the trees, her heart quiet but steady. The meadow looked the same as it always had, a place untouched by time. She stepped forward, the soft grass brushing against her ankles as she made her way toward the oak. The air was warm, but a cool breeze blew through the field, carrying with it the scent of earth and flowers. As she approached the tree, Elara's gaze drifted to the spot where they had sat together, side by side in the silence of that long afternoon. She stood there for a moment, her mind replaying the memory of his presence, the way the air had seemed to hum with the unspoken connection between them. There was something sacred about the stillness they had shared, something that went beyond the simplicity of their actions. She knelt down at the base of the tree, her fingers brushing lightly against the rough bark. The oak tree had stood there for generations, its roots deep in the earth, and now it felt as though it had become a part of her story, a silent witness to the unfolding of something she could not yet name. Elara leaned back against the trunk, her eyes closing as she let the quiet of the meadow wash over her. The sounds of the village, the distant murmur of life, faded into the background, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind through the leaves and the steady beat of her own heart. Time seemed to slow, as it always did in this place, the moments stretching out into an eternity of stillness. She didn't know how long she sat there, her thoughts drifting like the clouds above. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long shadows over the meadow as the day wore on. Elara's mind wandered to the stars, to the vast expanse of the night sky that stretched out above them all, silent and eternal. She thought of how the stars were like distant souls, burning brightly in the darkness, each one a point of light in the infinite void. They were separated by unimaginable distances, yet their light reached one another, connecting them in ways that defied the limitations of space and time. Perhaps, she thought, people were like stars. Perhaps the connections they shared were not bound by the physical world, but by something deeper, something that reached beyond the surface of things. The stranger had come into her life like a distant star, his light reaching her across the vast expanse of their separate worlds. And though they had not spoken, though they had shared no words, Elara felt as though their souls had brushed against one another in the stillness of that day. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the meadow. Elara stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were moving through water. The day was ending, and with it, the quiet reverie of the afternoon. But as she made her way back across the field, her heart felt lighter, as though the distance between her and the stranger had somehow grown smaller, even in his absence. The walk back through the woods was peaceful, the trees casting long shadows across the path. The air had cooled, and the sky above was tinged with the soft colors of twilight. Elara's steps were measured, her thoughts calm as she moved through the forest. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she would ever see the stranger again, but she no longer felt the need to understand it all. Some things, she realized, were meant to unfold in their own time, like the slow blooming of a flower or the gradual fading of the light at the end of the day. The connection she felt with the stranger was like the stars, distant, yet constant, a quiet presence that filled the spaces between them with light. As she stepped out of the woods and into the fading light of evening, Elara glanced up at the sky. The first stars had begun to appear, their faint glimmers just visible against the deepening blue. She smiled softly to herself, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. The distance between stars, she thought, was not as vast as it seemed. And with that thought, Elara turned toward home, the quiet certainty of the universe unfolding within her heart. Chapter 6: Shadows of the Past. The air had grown cooler in Willowbridge as the summer slowly gave way to the quiet whispers of autumn. The days were still warm, but there was a subtle change in the breeze, a crispness that spoke of the shifting season. The leaves on the trees, once a vibrant green, had begun to turn, their edges tinged with shades of gold and amber. The village seemed to move at a slower pace, as if preparing itself for the stillness of the months to come. Elara's days remained much the same, though she found herself spending more and more time walking the path through the woods, drawn by an unseen force to the meadow where she had first encountered the stranger. Each time she returned, the memory of their time together grew more vivid, as if the place itself held onto the moments they had shared, weaving them into the very fabric of the land. The meadow had changed too, though its beauty remained. The wildflowers, once in full bloom, had begun to fade, their colors less vibrant but no less lovely. The tall grasses swayed in the breeze, golden and dry, their heads bowing as if in acknowledgement of the coming cold. The oak tree, as always, stood tall and unwavering at the far end of the field, its leaves now a brilliant mix of green and gold, rustling softly in the wind. Elara visited the meadow often, always alone, always in silence. She had not seen the stranger again, but his absence did not trouble her. There was a sense of peace in knowing that whatever had begun between them would continue to unfold, whether they met again or not. Still, she could not help but wonder about him, who he was, where he had come from, and why their paths had crossed in such an unexpected way. It was on one such afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the air carried the scent of earth and fallen leaves, that Elara found herself thinking not of the stranger, but of her past. She hadn't thought much about the life she had left behind since coming to Willowbridge, but now, as she sat beneath the oak tree, her mind wandered to the years that had led her here. She had been young when she first left home, eager to escape the confines of the small town where she had been born. Her family had been kind, loving, but there had always been a restlessness in her heart, a desire for something more than the simple life that stretched out before her. She had left with little more than a bag of belongings and the hope that the world beyond her home would offer the adventure and meaning she had always craved. For a time, it had. The cities she visited were bright and bustling, filled with people and possibilities. She had worked in markets and taverns, and for a brief period, as an assistant to a local artist who had taught her to appreciate the beauty in everyday things. But no matter where she went or what she did, the restlessness remained, gnawing at the edges of her heart like a silent hunger. It wasn't until she found herself in Willowbridge, the small village nestled between the hills and the forest, that the restlessness had begun to fade. There was something about the quiet of the place, the way the land seemed to breathe in harmony with the people who lived there, that called to her in a way no city ever had. The meadows, the woods, the simple routines of village life, they had all offered her a peace she had never known she needed. Yet even in that peace, there were shadows, memories of a time before Willowbridge, of faces and moments that had shaped her, lingered just beneath the surface of her thoughts. She had loved before, once, long ago, in a time that now felt like a distant dream. The man she had cared for had been kind, gentle, and for a brief period, Elara had believed that her search for meaning, for connection, had come to an end. But like so many things in her life, that love had been fleeting. He had been a traveler, passing through the town where she had been living at the time. They had met by chance, their connection instant and undeniable, much like the one she had felt with the stranger. For a time, they had shared something beautiful, something that felt like it might last. But in the end, his journey had taken him elsewhere, and Elara had been left with the ache of something unfinished, something that had slipped through her fingers like sand. The pain of that loss had been sharp, cutting into her like a blade. She had spent months after his departure wandering, searching for something to fill the void he had left behind. But no matter where she went, or what she did, the emptiness remained, a constant companion in the quiet moments of her life. It was only after she had come to Willowbridge that the ache had begun to dull, the sharp edges of her grief softening into something more bearable. The village had offered her a new kind of peace, one that wasn't reliant on the presence of another person. Here, she had learned to be alone without feeling lonely, to find solace in the beauty of the world around her rather than in the fleeting connections she had once sought. And yet, as she sat beneath the oak tree, her thoughts drifting like the autumn leaves that fell softly to the ground, Elara couldn't help but wonder if the stranger was meant to fill the space that had been left behind. Was he another fleeting connection, destined to pass through her life as so many others had? Or was there something more, something deeper, that bound them together in ways she couldn't yet understand? The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above her and sending a shower of golden and red down around her like a gentle rain. Elara closed her eyes, letting the sound of the wind and the feel of the cool air on her skin wash over her. There was a comfort in the stillness, in the knowledge that the world moved forward, with or without the answers she sought. Time passed, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the meadow. Elara remained beneath the oak tree, her thoughts swirling like the leaves in the wind. The memories of her past, once so painful, no longer felt sharp. Instead, they were like old scars, faded, but still a part of her. They had shaped her, guided her to this place. And though she didn't yet know what the future held, she felt a quiet certainty that everything had happened as it was meant to. As the light began to fade and the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, Elara rose from her place beneath the oak tree. The meadow was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the colors of the earth muted but still beautiful. She stood for a moment, gazing out at the expanse of the field, her heart quiet but full. The path back through the woods was familiar, the way marked by the light of the moon now rising in the sky. Elara walked slowly, her footsteps soft on the earth, her mind clear. The memories of her past still lingered, but they no longer weighed her down. Instead, they felt like gentle reminders of the journey she had taken, the choices she had made, and the person she had become. And as she walked through the quiet of the forest, the sound of the leaves rustling softly in the breeze, Elara knew that the future, whatever it held, would come in its own time. There was no need to rush, no need to search for answers. The universe, she realized, had a way of unfolding exactly as it should. For now, she was content to walk in the shadows of the past, knowing that the light of the present would guide her toward whatever came next. And in the quiet of the night, beneath the canopy of stars, Elara continued her journey, one step at a time. Chapter 7. A Season of Waiting. The arrival of autumn in Willowbridge came quietly, like a long exhale from the earth. The once green hills and fields that surrounded the village turned to a sea of amber and gold, the leaves fluttering down from the trees in a slow, rhythmic dance. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of waiting, as though the world was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Elara felt this shift deeply. The warmth of the summer had faded, and with it, the vibrancy of the world around her seemed to dim. But rather than sadness, there was a sense of peace in the change, a natural slowing down, as if the earth itself was preparing to rest. It was a season of transition, a time of reflection, and for Elara, it brought with it a quiet acceptance of the unknown. Her walks through the woods continued, though the path was now littered with fallen leaves that crunched beneath her feet. The air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, and each breath she took seemed to clear her mind of the lingering uncertainties that had once clouded it. There was something soothing about the rhythm of the seasons, the way the world moved through its cycles without hesitation or doubt. The meadow, too, had changed. The wildflowers that had once bloomed so brightly had long since withered, their petals scattered by the wind. The grasses were dry and brittle, their golden heads bowed low as if in reverence to the coming winter. Even the oak tree, so strong and steadfast, had shed many of its leaves, leaving its branches bare and exposed to the sky. Yet despite these changes, the meadow remained beautiful in its own way. A different kind of beauty, quieter and more subdued, but no less meaningful. Elara often found herself drawn to the meadow, even though the stranger had not returned. She no longer expected him to appear, but his absence did not leave her feeling empty or forgotten. Instead, she felt a sense of quiet companionship in the memory of their brief connection, as though his presence still lingered in the air around her, a silent echo of something that had yet to fully reveal itself. There were days when she would sit beneath the oak tree for hours, watching as the light shifted across the sky, from the soft glow of morning to the golden hues of late afternoon. The world around her moved in its own slow rhythm. The gentle rustling of the leaves, the distant call of birds, the occasional gust of wind that sent a flurry of leaves spiraling through the air. In these moments, Elara found herself feeling more connected to the world than she ever had before. It was during one such afternoon, as she sat beneath the oak tree with her back against the rough bark, that her thoughts drifted once again to the stranger. She wondered where he was now, what path his life had taken since their brief encounter. There had been a calmness in his presence, a stillness that mirrored her own. And though they had not exchanged a single word, Elara felt as though she had known him for much longer than just that one afternoon. Perhaps, she thought, their meeting had been a part of the same rhythm that governed the seasons. Just as the leaves fell from the trees in autumn, only to grow back in the spring, perhaps people, too, moved through cycles, crossing paths, drifting apart, and then coming together again when the time was right. Elara had always believed that the universe had its own way of guiding people toward where they were meant to be. It was a belief that had carried her through the many changes in her life, through the restlessness of her youth and the heartbreak of love lost. And now, as she sat in the stillness of the meadow, that belief felt truer than ever. The village of Willowbridge had also begun to slow with the arrival of autumn. The bustling market, once filled with the vibrant colors of summer produce, now carried the muted tones of root vegetables and grains. The villagers moved at a more leisurely pace, their conversations quieter, their movements more deliberate. It was as if the entire village was preparing for the long winter ahead, gathering what they needed before the cold set in. Elara's routine remained much the same. Her mornings spent tending to her small garden, which had mostly withered with the changing season, and her afternoons walking the familiar paths through the woods. But there was a new kind of stillness in her heart, a sense that she no longer needed to search for meaning in every moment. The world moved at its own pace, and she had learned to move with it. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting the village in a warm, golden light, Elara decided to visit the old stone bridge that spanned the river at the edge of Willowbridge. It was a place she had not visited in some time, though it held many memories for her. The bridge had been one of the first places she had discovered when she arrived in the village, and it had become a quiet refuge for her in the early days, when the restlessness in her heart had still been strong. The path to the bridge was lined with trees, their branches now bare against the sky. The river, once flowing swiftly with the summer rains, had slowed to a gentle trickle, its surface reflecting the fading light of the sunset. Elara stood on the bridge for a long time, leaning against the cool stone and watching as the water flowed beneath her. The river, like the seasons, moved in its own time, carving its path through the land without hurry or hesitation. As she stood there, the memories of her past came flooding back, not in a painful way, but with a quiet acceptance. She thought of the towns she had lived in, the people she had met, the moments of joy and sorrow that had shaped her. Each memory felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that was still being put together, slowly and carefully. And in the stillness of that evening, as the last light of day faded into the cool blue of twilight, Elara realized that she was no longer waiting for something to happen. For so long, she had moved through her life with a sense of expectation, always looking for the next moment that would give her the answers she sought. But now, as the seasons changed and the world around her slowed, she understood that the answers would come in their own time, just as the leaves would return to the trees in spring, and the river would swell once more with the rains. The journey she had been on, both the physical one that had brought her to Willowbridge and the internal one that had shaped her heart, was not about finding a single moment of clarity or purpose. It was about learning to live in the rhythm of the world, to trust that each step she took was part of something larger, something she could not yet see. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Elara turned away from the river and made her way back toward the village. The night air was cool, but there was a sense of warmth in her heart, a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The season of waiting, she realized, was not about longing or uncertainty. It was about learning to move with the world, to find peace in the stillness, and to trust that the future would unfold as it was meant to. And so, with the sound of the river fading behind her and the soft glow of the village lights guiding her home, Elara walked into the night, content in the knowledge that the journey was far from over. Chapter 8. The Silent Solitude. The first frost came to Willowbridge in the early morning hours, before the sun had risen. Elara awoke to the sight of the world coated in a thin layer of white, the delicate frost shimmering on the grass and trees like a dusting of powdered silver. The village had become eerily quiet, the sounds of life muted by the cold air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable arrival of winter. The chill in the air crept through the walls of her cottage, and Elara bundled herself in layers of wool and fleece before stepping outside. The frost crunched under her boots as she walked, the sharpness of the cold biting at her cheeks and nose. The sky was still a soft, pale gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. Her breath came out in small, visible puffs as she made her way through the village, past houses with smoke curling from chimneys, past gardens that had long since been harvested, their bare earth now hard and unyielding. The streets were empty, as most of the villagers had taken refuge indoors, preparing for the long stretch of winter that lay ahead. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that time itself had slowed, matching the lethargic pace of the season. Elara found herself drawn once more to the woods, the trees now stark and skeletal against the dull sky. The path she had walked so many times before was familiar, though it had changed with the frost. The leaves that had once blanketed the ground in vibrant colors were now brittle and frozen, their edges curling in on themselves like parchment left too long in the cold. The branches of the trees, once lush with foliage, now stood bare and exposed, their dark limbs stretching upward like fingers grasping at the sky. She moved slowly, her steps careful as she navigated the icy patches that had formed along the path. There was a stillness in the woods, a kind of silence that went beyond the absence of sound. It was a quiet that seemed to seep into her very bones, wrapping around her like the cold air. But it wasn't an unpleasant silence. Rather, it felt comforting, like the world was offering her a space to simply be. The meadow appeared before her, its once lively expanse now blanketed in frost. The wildflowers had long since disappeared, leaving only the dry stalks of grass to sway gently in the breeze. Even the oak tree, so strong and constant, seemed to have succumbed to the weight of the season, its branches heavy with frost, its leaves all but gone. Elara made her way to the oak tree, her breath steady in the cold air, her heart calm in the quiet. She sat at the base of the tree, her back resting against the rough bark, and gazed out at the expanse of the meadow. The world seemed frozen in time, as if the frost had stopped everything in its tracks, holding it in place until the warmth of spring could melt it back to life. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did in the quiet moments. She thought of the village, of the lives unfolding around her, each one moving at its own pace, each person carrying their own burdens and joys. She thought of the stranger, whose presence had lingered in her mind like a shadow, even though he had not returned. And she thought of herself, of the journey that had brought her to this place, to this moment of stillness in the midst of a frozen world. There was a kind of clarity that came with the cold, a sharpness that cut through the fog of her thoughts and left her with a deeper understanding of herself. She had spent so much of her life searching for meaning, for purpose, for connection. But now, as she sat in the silence of the frosty meadow, she realized that the search was not the point. It was the stillness, the moments of quiet reflection, that held the answers she had been looking for all along. She had always believed that she needed to keep moving, to keep searching, in order to find what she was looking for. But now she understood that sometimes, the greatest revelations came in the moments when everything stopped, when the world was still, and the only sound was the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. The frost-covered meadow stretched out before her, a vast, frozen landscape that seemed to go on forever. But in the stillness of that moment, Elara felt no need to move, no urge to chase after the next thing. She was content to simply be, to exist in the quiet, in the solitude, in the frozen beauty of the world around her. Time passed slowly, the sun never fully breaking through the clouds. The frost remained, glistening in the soft, pale light, as if the meadow had been transformed into a land of crystal and ice. Elara remained beneath the oak tree, her thoughts drifting like the wind, her heart at peace. Eventually, as the day wore on, she rose from her place beneath the tree and began the slow walk back to the village. The cold air nipped at her skin, but she welcomed it, feeling more alive in the crispness of the frost than she had in the warmth of summer. The path through the woods was quiet, the trees standing tall and silent, their branches heavy with the weight of the season. As she neared the edge of the village, the familiar sight of smoke curling from chimneys greeted her, and she felt a sense of warmth despite the chill in the air. The streets were still empty, but the lights in the windows of the houses glowed softly, a reminder that life continued, even in the stillness of winter. Elara returned to her cottage, the warmth of the fire welcoming her as she stepped inside. She shed her layers of wool and fleece, hanging them by the door to dry, and sat by the hearth, watching as the flames danced and flickered. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, a soft and steady rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. As the evening settled in, the frost outside thickened, the world growing even colder as the sun disappeared completely. But inside her small cottage, Elara felt a warmth that went beyond the fire. It was a warmth that came from within, a quiet contentment that had settled into her soul during the long hours of solitude. Winter had come to Willowbridge, and with it, a season of silence and stillness. But for the first time in her life, Elara didn't feel restless in the quiet. She didn't feel the need to search for something beyond the moment. She had found peace in the solitude, in the rhythm of the world as it moved through its cycles. The frost would melt in time, the cold would give way to warmth, and the world would bloom again. But for now, Elara was content to wait, to let the season unfold as it was meant to, without rushing or longing for what was to come. And so, in the quiet of her cottage, with the frost clinging to the world outside and the warmth of the fire flickering softly within, Elara allowed herself to rest. The season of waiting had begun, and she embraced it with open arms. Chapter 9. The Deepening Cold. As winter settled fully over Willowbridge, the cold grew deeper, more unforgiving. The frost that had once coated the grass and trees in delicate silver now gave way to thick layers of ice, and the world seemed encased in a hardened shell of frozen stillness. The sky remained a constant blanket of gray, the sun only a faint glow behind the heavy clouds, offering little warmth and even less light. Days blurred into one another, a seemingly endless stretch of cold, quiet hours. Elara felt the weight of the season as it pressed down on her, but rather than resisting it, she leaned into the quietude it brought. Her days had taken on a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as though the cold had seeped into time itself, stretching each moment into something larger and more significant. The bustling energy that had filled the village during the warmer months had vanished, replaced by a kind of collective hibernation. People stayed indoors, fires burned long into the night, and the streets were often empty, save for the occasional figure hurrying home from some necessary task. Elara's walks became shorter, for the cold was sharp and biting, cutting through even her warmest clothes. But she continued to venture out into the woods, drawn by the stark beauty of the landscape in its winter form. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like dark, twisted sculptures. Snow had begun to fall, slowly at first, dusting the ground in a fine white powder, and then heavier, piling up in soft drifts that made the paths almost unrecognizable. The meadow, once alive with color and movement, now lay buried beneath the snow, a vast, unbroken expanse of white. The oak tree stood alone, its branches coated in ice, every twig and leaf gone, leaving only the barest framework of the mighty tree that had once been so full of life. Elara stood at the edge of the meadow, her breath clouding in front of her face, and for a long time, she simply looked. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creaking of the trees as the wind passed through them, and the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. There was a stillness in the winter landscape that Elara found both beautiful and strange. It was a world in suspension, as if time had stopped and everything had been frozen in place. The river, once flowing with life, was now covered in a thick layer of ice, its surface so smooth it reflected the overcast sky like a mirror. The woods, too, seemed different, quieter, emptier, as though the animals that usually filled it had retreated to some secret place, leaving the forest to sleep through the winter months. Yet despite the cold and the stillness, Elara felt no sense of loss or emptiness. There was something comforting in the way the world had slowed down, in the way the snow covered everything, softening the harsh edges and creating a sense of peace. The village, too, had taken on a different kind of beauty in the winter light. The rooftops were blanketed in snow, the streets lined with tall drifts, and the windows of the cottages glowed warmly in the evening as fires crackled inside. The smoke from the chimneys rose in thin wisps into the sky, disappearing into the cold air. Elara spent much of her time indoors, the warmth of her cottage a welcome refuge from the bitter chill outside. The fire in her hearth became a constant companion, its flames dancing and flickering, casting a soft, orange glow that lit the small space with a comforting warmth. She would sit for hours by the fire, a book in her lap or her knitting in hand, the quiet sound of the flames filling the room. The cold outside made the warmth within feel even more precious, and there was a deep sense of contentment in these simple moments. The days passed slowly, each one much like the last. Elara no longer felt the pull of time as she once had, no longer counted the days or marked the passing of the weeks. Winter had a way of making everything feel timeless, as though the outside world had fallen into a deep sleep, and all she needed to do was wait for it to wake again. It was a season of patience, of endurance, and Elara embraced it with a quiet acceptance. But the cold also brought with it a kind of loneliness, one that crept in at the edges of the stillness. The village was quiet, the streets often deserted, and there were days when Elara didn't see another soul. The isolation was not unwelcome. She had chosen this life, after all, and she had always valued her independence and solitude. But there were moments when the silence felt heavier than usual, when the absence of life around her pressed down on her heart. On those days, she would sit by the window and watch the snow fall, the world outside growing more distant and unreachable. The meadow, once so full of promise and possibility, now seemed like a distant memory, a place she could no longer touch. The oak tree stood alone in the vast expanse of white, a solitary figure in a world that had gone quiet. And though Elara had found peace in the stillness, there was a part of her that longed for the warmth and life that had once filled the landscape. She thought often of the stranger, the man who had appeared so briefly in her life, only to vanish just as quickly. His presence had been a quiet one, yet it had left a lasting impression, like a footprint in the snow that remained long after the person had walked away. She wondered where he was now, whether he was somewhere warm, or whether he, too, was walking through a winter landscape, feeling the weight of the season as she did. As the days continued to grow colder, Elara found herself thinking more and more about the nature of time, of how the seasons moved in cycles, each one giving way to the next in an endless loop. Winter would pass, as it always did, and spring would come again. The snow would melt, the trees would blossom, and the world would return to life. But for now, winter held the world in its icy grip, and all she could do was wait. There was a beauty in the waiting, she realized, a kind of grace in the way the earth prepared itself for the new life that would come. The trees, though bare, were not dead. They were simply resting, gathering their strength for the coming season. The river, though frozen, was not still. Beneath the ice, the water continued to flow, slowly and silently, waiting for the warmth of the sun to free it from its frozen prison. And Elara, too, was waiting, though she wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Perhaps it was simply the return of the warmth, the end of the cold, or perhaps it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. But whatever it was, she knew that it would come in its own time, just as the seasons always did. As the snow continued to fall, Elara stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass, and watched as the world outside disappeared beneath a thick blanket of white. The cold pressed in, but inside her small cottage, the fire burned brightly, its warmth steady and constant. And in that moment, as the winter deepened around her, Elara felt a quiet certainty settle into her heart. The world was cold and still, but beneath the surface, life was waiting. Chapter 10. The Thawing Heart. As winter lingered over Willowbridge, the days began to shift imperceptibly. The sun, once a mere ghost behind the clouds, began to break through occasionally, casting warm patches of light on the white landscape. The world, it seemed, was beginning to stir from its long, deep slumber. Elara watched the slow transition with quiet anticipation, her heart lifting with the promise of change. The snow that had blanketed the meadow for so long began to melt, revealing the tips of dried grass and the occasional stubborn wildflower peeking through the frost. The ice on the river, once a solid sheet, started to crack and break apart, the sound echoing through the stillness of the woods like a distant promise. Elara could hear the water flowing beneath, its gentle song calling out to her, inviting her to join in the awakening of the world. Despite the chill that still lingered in the air, there was a palpable sense of hope as she ventured out into the woods once more. The frost-covered branches sparkled in the sunlight, and the scent of earth, warmed by the sun's rays, began to rise from the ground, a fragrant reminder of life beneath the surface. The world felt different, charged with energy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the moment to burst forth. Elara found herself drawn back to the meadow, where the oak tree stood tall and proud against the backdrop of a slowly changing landscape. The snow around its base had begun to melt, revealing patches of brown earth, still damp and rich from the winter's freeze. She approached the tree, her heart racing with the excitement of new beginnings, and placed her hand on the rough bark, feeling the pulse of life that thrummed beneath the surface. There was something sacred about this time of year, as if the world was not only waking from its slumber but was also healing, shedding the heaviness of winter in favor of something lighter, brighter. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, filled with the promise of spring. In that stillness, she could feel her own heart thawing, the edges of her solitude softening as hope began to take root. With each passing day, she ventured further into the woods, exploring paths that had been hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. The familiar landscape was transforming before her eyes, each step revealing new signs of life. Buds began to swell on the branches of trees, and small animals started to emerge from their hiding places, timid yet curious, eager to greet the changing season. Elara often found herself returning to the meadow, where she would sit beneath the oak tree for hours, watching the slow unfolding of the world around her. The air felt different now, thicker with possibility, charged with energy. She listened intently to the sounds of the forest as they began to return. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant sound of water flowing freely once more. One afternoon, as she sat beneath the oak, she noticed a small group of snowdrops breaking through the thawing ground, their delicate white petals peeking out like tiny stars against the brown earth. A rush of joy surged through her at this small yet powerful sign of life. Elara reached out to touch the fragile flowers, marveling at their resilience, their ability to push through the remnants of winter and embrace the light. With the arrival of these blooms came a wave of emotion, realization that life was not just about surviving the cold, but also about finding joy in the moments of beauty, no matter how small. She understood now that her solitude, once a source of loneliness, had transformed into a space for reflection and growth. The quiet moments she had cherished were not just a pause in her journey, but a crucial part of it. As the days turned into weeks, Elara found herself embracing the change within her. She began to nurture her garden once more, preparing the soil for the plants that would soon fill her small plot with color and life. The act of digging, planting, and caring for the earth filled her with purpose and excitement. Each seed she placed in the ground felt like a promise, a commitment to the beauty that was to come. The village, too, began to awaken. The markets, once empty and quiet, buzzed with activity as villagers emerged from their winter hibernation, eager to share stories and laughter. The once desolate streets were filled with children playing, their laughter ringing out like music in the fresh air. Elara watched from her window, a smile on her face, as life returned to Willowbridge. And yet, despite the joy that surrounded her, she could not shake the feeling of longing that still lingered in her heart. The memory of the stranger, his quiet presence, the connection they had shared, haunted her thoughts. Though the world was awakening, a part of her still felt incomplete, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, to return and fill the spaces left behind. On particularly bright days, Elara would find herself wandering to the edge of the village, standing at the very spot where she had first encountered him. The memories flooded back, vivid and powerful, and she could almost feel his presence beside her, the warmth of their shared silence wrapping around her like a blanket. But as the days turned into weeks, and the promise of spring began to bloom, she realized that she could not hold on to the past forever. She had learned to embrace the stillness, to find beauty in the quiet moments, and now she needed to embrace change as well. The world was moving forward, and so must she. The warmth of the sun, the vibrant colors beginning to emerge, and the laughter of children in the village all urged her to let go of what had been and open her heart to what could be. And so, one bright afternoon, Elara stood at the edge of the meadow, the sun casting a golden glow on the earth, and made a silent promise to herself. She would let the past be a part of her journey, but she would not let it define her. The world was full of possibilities, and she was ready to embrace them, to step into the future with open arms. As she turned away from the meadow, a sense of freedom washed over her. The air felt lighter, the sun warmer on her skin. Elara walked back toward the village, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The thawing of winter had not just brought forth new life in the landscape. It had awakened something within her, a sense of hope, a recognition of her own strength, and a commitment to her journey. With each step she took, she felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The days ahead were full of promise, and as she looked toward the horizon, she could almost see the vibrant colors of spring emerging in the distance, waiting for her to discover them. The thaw had begun, not just in the world around her, but within her heart, and she welcomed it with open arms. Chapter 11. The Blooming Season. As spring unfurled its wings over Willowbridge, the world burst forth in vibrant hues, painting the landscape in colors that had lain dormant through the long winter months. Elara could feel the change in the air, a sweet, earthy scent that mingled with the crispness of dawn. Each morning brought new surprises as buds opened and flowers unfurled, a symphony of life awakening all around her. Elara spent her days outside, relishing the warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle breeze that rustled through the trees, and the sound of birds returning to the woods, their melodies weaving through the air like an enchanting lullaby. She tended to her garden with newfound enthusiasm, planting seeds of every kind: bright marigolds, fragrant basil, and delicate forget-me-nots. Each time she buried a seed in the rich soil, she felt as if she were planting a piece of her heart, nurturing it for the future. The village, too, transformed as people emerged from their homes, shaking off the lethargy of winter. The markets bustled with life, stalls brimming with fresh produce, flowers, and handmade goods. Laughter echoed in the streets as children raced each other, their joyful shouts mingling with the chatter of neighbors reconnecting after months apart. Elara wandered through the market, soaking in the sights and sounds, feeling a deep sense of belonging. Yet amid the lively atmosphere, the memory of the stranger lingered at the edges of her thoughts. It was not a haunting presence, but a gentle reminder of what she had felt in that brief moment they shared. Though she had resolved to embrace the present, a part of her still yearned for that connection, for a spark of understanding and companionship. One sunny afternoon, Elara decided to take her garden work to the next level. She gathered her tools and set out to create a small patch in the meadow, near the oak tree, a place where she could enjoy the beauty of nature while cultivating her plants. The idea excited her. The meadow would be her sanctuary, a space where the flowers could thrive and where she could reflect on her journey. As she arrived at the meadow, she paused, taking in the scene. The oak tree, standing tall and majestic, had begun to bud, its branches adorned with tender green leaves that danced in the gentle breeze. Elara knelt down and began to work the soil, loosening the earth and preparing it for the seeds. With every stroke of the spade, she felt a sense of purpose. This was her space, a reflection of her spirit. Hours slipped by as she immersed herself in the task, the world around her fading into the background. She planted seeds with care, envisioning the blooms that would grace the meadow in just a few weeks. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light that enveloped the landscape. Elara took a moment to lean back on her heels, wiping her brow and admiring her work. It was in that moment of tranquility that she sensed something shift in the air. The familiar rustling of leaves caught her attention, and she turned to see a figure approaching from the path that led through the woods. A flutter of recognition ignited within her chest, her heart racing as she squinted against the sunlight to see the figure clearly. As he drew closer, the details came into focus. It was him, the stranger from her memory, the man whose presence had lingered in her heart. His hair, tousled by the wind, glinted in the sunlight, and a soft smile spread across his face as he noticed her. Elara stood frozen, her heart pounding, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. The months that had passed felt like a lifetime, yet here he was, standing before her, as if no time had elapsed at all. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them, as if they both recognized the gravity of this moment. He moved closer, and as he did, the world around them seemed to fade away. The vibrant colors of spring, the gentle sound of the breeze, the distant laughter of children. All of it receded, leaving only the two of them, suspended in time. Elara could feel the warmth of his presence, the energy radiating from him, and she knew in her heart that this was a moment to cherish. With a small gesture, he pointed toward the meadow, and Elara instinctively understood. He admired her work, the small patch of earth she had cultivated with love and care. She felt a swell of pride, knowing that he could see the beauty she had created, the life she had nurtured. In silence, they began to work together. He knelt beside her, joining in the task of planting, digging, and preparing the ground for new life. Their movements became synchronized, a natural rhythm forming between them as they shared this simple yet profound experience. Words were unnecessary. Their connection transcended language, blossoming in the shared understanding of creation. As they worked side by side, Elara stole glances at him, captivated by the way the sunlight played upon his features. The gentle lines of his face, the way his eyes sparkled with laughter. He was as striking as she remembered. And in this shared silence, something new began to bloom between them. An unspoken bond that felt both thrilling and reassuring. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the meadow. They paused for a moment, sitting back on their heels, their hands dirty from the soil. Elara looked at the patch they had worked on together. Seeds nestled in the earth, waiting to burst forth into life. A sense of accomplishment enveloped them, a feeling that they had created something meaningful in this beautiful place. Time continued to flow, yet it felt like they were in a bubble, cocooned from the world around them. As the sky began to darken, the first stars twinkled above, and the air turned cool. They remained side by side, comfortable in the silence, their hearts beating in harmony. With the evening settling in, the stranger turned to her, his eyes filled with warmth and sincerity. Though no words were exchanged, she could feel the unspoken promise hanging in the air. The recognition that this moment was just the beginning, a step towards something more. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Elara felt a rush of hope and excitement. The world was alive around her, bursting with color and potential, and here, in the heart of spring, she had found a connection that filled her spirit. The thawing of winter had brought new life not only to the earth, but also to her heart. With the stars now shining brightly above, they began to gather their tools, preparing to leave the meadow behind for the night. But Elara knew this was not a goodbye. It was a promise of tomorrow, a promise that they would return to this space, to continue nurturing the seeds they had planted, both in the earth and within themselves. As they walked back toward the village, side by side, the cool evening air wrapped around them like a gentle embrace. Elara's heart was alight with the possibilities that lay ahead, and she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The stranger was no longer just a memory. He had become a part of her story, a chapter unfolding with each passing day. And as spring bloomed in all its glory, so too did their connection, delicate yet strong, a bond forged in silence but destined to flourish in the warmth of the sun. Chapter 12. The Dance of New Beginnings. With each passing day, the bond between Elara and the stranger deepened, transforming the once solitary moments into shared experiences filled with warmth and laughter. As spring continued to unfold its vibrant tapestry over Willowbridge, the days grew longer and the air filled with the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers. The meadow, once a blank canvas of white, was now alive with color, a testament to their efforts and the promise of new beginnings. Elara found herself awakening with the sun, drawn to the warmth and brightness that spilled through her window. Each morning, she would rush to her garden, eager to see what new miracles had emerged overnight. The seeds they had planted together had sprouted, tiny green shoots stretching toward the sun, and every time she spotted a new bloom, her heart soared with joy. The stranger, whose name she had learned was Caleb, often joined her in the mornings, and together they tended to the garden, their laughter mingling with the songs of birds in the trees. There was a rhythm to their days, an unspoken understanding that made even the simplest tasks feel meaningful. They would work side by side, their hands in the soil, sharing smiles and glances that spoke volumes, each look a thread weaving their hearts closer together. As the days turned warmer, they ventured further into the woods, exploring the hidden paths and discovering secret clearings bathed in sunlight. The forest, once a backdrop to Elara's solitude, became a magical realm where they could escape the world and find solace in one another's company. They wandered beneath the canopy of trees, the dappled sunlight creating patterns on the forest floor, and in those moments, Elara felt as if they were suspended in a dream. One afternoon, they stumbled upon a small glen, a hidden paradise surrounded by wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. The colors were breathtaking, pinks, yellows, and blues blending together in a riot of life. Elara's heart swelled with the beauty of the moment, and she turned to Caleb, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Together, they laid down in the grass, letting the sun warm their skin as they watched the clouds drift lazily overhead. In the serenity of the glen, Elara felt a connection with Caleb that transcended words. Their hands brushed against one another, fingers intertwining in a simple yet profound gesture. She could feel the warmth of his touch, and it sent shivers down her spine. In that moment, the world around them faded, and all that existed was the soft sound of their breathing and the rhythmic beating of their hearts. As spring continued to blossom, the village came alive with festivals and gatherings, celebrating the season of renewal. Elara and Caleb attended these events together, their laughter ringing through the air like music. The villagers welcomed Caleb with open arms, drawn to his genuine spirit and the way he complemented Elara's warmth. Together, they danced under the stars, the flickering lanterns illuminating their smiles, their movements weaving a tapestry of joy. But beneath the surface of their blossoming romance lay a current of uncertainty. Elara often found herself wondering about the life Caleb had left behind. She sensed that he had his own story, one filled with chapters that had shaped him into the man she had come to admire. Though he never spoke of his past, she could feel the shadows that sometimes flickered across his eyes when he thought no one was looking. It made her both curious and cautious, for she knew that every heart carried its own burdens. One evening, as they strolled through the village, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, Elara stole a glance at Caleb. He walked beside her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his gaze lost in the horizon. A pang of longing surged within her, an urge to delve deeper into his world, to uncover the layers that made him who he was. In that moment, she resolved to be patient. She understood that trust takes time to build, and that every story unfolds at its own pace. The connection they shared was undeniable, but she would not rush the process. Instead, she focused on the joy of their present, allowing their relationship to flourish naturally, like the flowers in her garden. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, their bond strengthened. They shared quiet evenings filled with stargazing, their shoulders brushing against each other as they lay on a blanket spread across the grass. They exchanged stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and the moments that had shaped them into who they were. Though Caleb remained reticent about certain parts of his past, Elara found comfort in the little glimpses he offered, pieces of a puzzle that left her wanting more. One particularly warm day, they returned to the glen, the sun casting a golden glow that made the wildflowers shimmer like jewels. They settled on the grass, surrounded by nature's beauty, and Elara decided it was the perfect moment to express her feelings. She turned to Caleb, her heart racing, ready to share the depth of her emotions. But just as she opened her mouth, a sudden breeze swept through the glen, rustling the leaves and carrying away her words. Caleb glanced at her, his expression curious yet gentle. In that instant, she realized that perhaps it wasn't the right time to speak her truth. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken emotions, and she felt a sense of connection that needed no words. Instead, they lay back on the grass, their hands entwined, and allowed the serenity of the moment to envelop them. As they gazed up at the sky, Elara felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The beauty of their surroundings mirrored the beauty of their relationship, both delicate yet strong, each day bringing new layers of understanding and affection. She breathed deeply, soaking in the scents of the earth and flowers, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. In that moment, she understood that their journey was just beginning, and that the path ahead was filled with promise. The days turned into a blur of colors and laughter, with Elara and Caleb continuing to explore the wonders of spring together. They picked wildflowers, their hands brushing as they reached for the same bloom. They shared meals in the meadows, the warmth of the sun wrapping around them like a cozy blanket. Every moment was a treasure, a piece of the puzzle that was their relationship. Yet, as the season progressed, a feeling of impending change began to settle over Elara. She sensed that Caleb was grappling with something deep within himself, an internal struggle that he hadn't yet shared. Though he smiled and laughed, there were times when she caught him staring off into the distance, lost in thought, the weight of his past lingering like a shadow. One evening, as they returned from a day spent exploring the countryside, Elara noticed a tension in Caleb's posture. His hands were clenched, and his brow furrowed as they walked. She reached out to touch his arm, her heart aching to ease his burden. But instead of opening up, he simply smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. That night, as Elara lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. She yearned to understand Caleb completely, to be the support he needed, but she also knew that it was his journey to navigate. As she drifted into sleep, she resolved to be patient, to allow him the space he needed while remaining steadfast by his side. Days turned into weeks, and the cycle of life continued to flourish around them. The world was alive with color, and as the spring flowers bloomed, so did the hope in Elara's heart. Their bond grew deeper, yet the unspoken weight of Caleb's past loomed like a distant storm cloud, threatening to overshadow the beauty of their present. In her heart, Elara understood that every relationship requires vulnerability, and she believed that Caleb would eventually find the courage to share his truth. Until then, she would cherish every moment they spent together, every laugh they shared, and every touch that ignited a spark within her. She would continue to nurture the garden they had created, both in the meadow and in her heart, knowing that love, like nature, takes time to flourish. With the arrival of summer just around the corner, Elara felt a sense of excitement building within her. The warmth of the sun, the vibrancy of life, and the promise of new adventures filled her with hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on, alongside Caleb. Together, they would navigate the path of their journey, hand in hand, embracing each moment as it came. And as she closed her eyes that night, she dreamt of blooming flowers, of laughter and warmth, and of the beautiful story that was still being written, a story of love, growth, and the magic of new beginnings. Chapter 13. The Unraveling Threads. As summer approached, the days grew longer and warmer, the golden sun casting a bright light over Willowbridge. The meadows bloomed in a riot of colors, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of wildflowers. Elara found herself lost in the beauty surrounding her, each day filled with the promise of new adventures alongside Caleb. Their bond, strengthened by shared experiences, felt like a tapestry woven with threads of laughter, warmth, and unspoken connection. Yet, beneath the vibrant surface, a storm was brewing. Elara could sense it in the subtle shifts of Caleb's demeanor. The moments of quiet reflection had grown more frequent, and there were times when his laughter felt strained, as if he were wearing a mask to hide the turmoil within. She longed to reach out, to peel back the layers of his heart and uncover the shadows that danced just beyond her grasp. One afternoon, they found themselves wandering through the sun-drenched woods, the leaves rustling overhead in a gentle breeze. The light filtered through the branches, casting intricate patterns on the forest floor, and Elara felt a sense of peace enveloping her. They walked side by side, but an unspoken tension lingered in the air, making the silence feel heavy. As they reached a clearing, Elara stopped to take in the beauty of their surroundings. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of green. She closed her eyes, inhaling the fragrant air, and when she opened them, she turned to Caleb. He stood a few paces away, his gaze distant, lost in thought. Her heart ached at the sight of him, knowing that he carried burdens she could not yet see. Determined to break through the silence, Elara reached for a nearby flower, plucking it gently from the ground. The delicate petals trembled in her hand, and she offered it to Caleb, a silent gesture of support and understanding. He turned to her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, But he did not take the flower. Instead, he offered her a faint smile before looking away again, his expression clouded. Elara's heart sank. She had hoped this simple gesture would encourage him to open up, but the walls around his heart seemed to grow higher. She dropped the flower, watching as it tumbled into the grass, a symbol of her unfulfilled desire to connect with him. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of their unspoken words grew heavier, wrapping around them like a shroud. They continued their walk, but the vibrant landscape felt muted, the colors less vivid. Elara tried to shake off the sense of foreboding that clung to her. She wanted to believe that they would weather this storm together, that Caleb would eventually find the strength to share his truth. Yet, the uncertainty gnawed at her, creating a restlessness that she could not ignore. Days turned into weeks, and summer unfolded in all its glory. Yet the distance between Elara and Caleb remained palpable. Their days were filled with laughter and warmth, but the nights were filled with silence, a silence that echoed with the weight of unsaid things. Elara could feel her heart aching for him, longing for the connection they once shared so effortlessly. One evening, after a particularly beautiful day spent in the meadows, Elara decided to invite Caleb for a picnic under the stars. She prepared a simple meal, gathering fresh bread, cheese, and berries, and packed them carefully into a basket. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, she laid out a blanket beneath the oak tree in the meadow, the place where they had spent so many joyful moments. When Caleb arrived, the atmosphere felt electric with anticipation. The stars twinkled above them, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. Elara smiled brightly, eager to share the evening with him, but as they sat down, she sensed a heaviness in the air, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. They began to eat, the silence stretching between them, and Elara felt her heart race with the need to break through the barrier that had formed. She glanced at Caleb, noticing the way he stared into the distance, his brow furrowed as if he were wrestling with inner demons. The moment felt fragile, and she took a deep breath, summoning the courage to reach out. Elara placed her hand gently on his, a soft touch meant to convey her support. But instead of the warmth she had hoped for, Caleb flinched slightly, pulling his hand away as if her touch had startled him. The rejection stung, and Elara felt her heart drop, the weight of his unspoken struggles pressing down on her. She lowered her gaze to the blanket, the vibrant food before them suddenly feeling inconsequential. The air between them felt charged with unexpressed emotions, and she struggled to find the right words to bridge the distance. But no words came, only silence, a silence filled with longing and frustration. As the night wore on, Elara tried to focus on the stars above, the vastness of the universe reminding her of the beauty that existed beyond their struggles. But even the stars seemed to dim in the face of her growing despair. She wanted nothing more than to reach Caleb, to understand the shadows that haunted him, but every attempt felt like pushing against a wall. In that moment of heartache, she realized how helpless she felt. She loved him, but love alone was not enough to dismantle the barriers he had built around his heart. The realization settled heavily in her chest, leaving her feeling adrift in a sea of uncertainty. After a long silence, Caleb finally turned to her, his expression softening. For the briefest moment, Elara thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimmer of the man she knew was hiding behind the walls. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the familiar mask he wore to shield himself from the world. They finished the meal in silence, the stars above watching over them like silent witnesses to their unraveling. Elara's heart ached with the weight of unspoken words, and as she packed up the picnic, she felt the distance between them grow. The night sky, once a source of wonder, now felt like a reminder of everything left unsaid. As they walked back toward the village, the moon casting a silvery glow on the path, Elara could feel the tension lingering in the air. She wanted to reach out, to pull Caleb close and demand that he share his truth, but she knew that forcing him to open up would only push him further away. Instead, she chose to walk beside him in silence, the space between them filled with unfulfilled longing. When they reached the edge of the village, Caleb paused, turning to her with a seriousness that made her heart race. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, but no words came. The moment hung between them, heavy with potential, and Elara held her breath, hoping against hope that this was the moment he would finally share what had been weighing on him. But just as quickly, he shook his head slightly, a look of frustration crossing his features. He turned away, his shoulders tense, and Elara felt her heart sink. In that moment, she realized that while she could offer him her heart, she could not force him to accept it. He was trapped in a battle of his own making, and all she could do was stand by and hope that one day he would find the courage to let her in. With a heavy heart, she bid him good night, watching as he walked away, the distance between them stretching once more. As she returned to her home, tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, the weight of her unfulfilled hopes pressing down on her. She felt a deep ache within her, a longing for the connection they once shared, a desire to break through the barriers that had grown between them. That night, as Elara lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of despair that clung to her. She had thought they were moving forward, but now it felt as if they were teetering on the edge of a precipice, uncertain of what lay beyond. She yearned for Caleb to trust her, to open his heart and share his burdens, but she understood that this was a journey he had to navigate on his own. As she closed her eyes, she resolved to remain patient, to be the light that guided him through the darkness. No matter how difficult the path became, she would stand by him, ready to catch him if he stumbled. The love they shared was worth the wait, and she knew that one day, the threads of their stories would intertwine once more, weaving a tapestry of hope and healing. With that thought, she drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with images of wildflowers and starlit skies, a reminder that even amidst uncertainty, beauty still thrived. And as the summer sun rose the next day, illuminating the world around her, Elara held onto the hope that the storm within Caleb would eventually pass, making way for the blooming love they both so desperately sought. Chapter 14. The Tempest Within. As summer deepened, the air became thick with warmth, the vibrant colors of nature surrounding Elara and Caleb a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within Caleb's heart. The days unfolded with the same gentle rhythm, yet a palpable tension hung in the air, an undercurrent of unease that Elara could no longer ignore. She watched him with growing concern, noting the way his laughter often felt forced, his smiles fleeting, as if he were hiding a storm beneath his calm exterior. Elara decided that she would not shy away from the truth any longer. While patience had been her guiding light, she felt the need to create an environment where Caleb could open up, a safe haven for his thoughts and fears. She longed to see him shed the weight he carried, to let the sunshine in after the rain. One bright morning, Elara invited Caleb to join her in the garden. The flowers were in full bloom, each petal a testament to the love and care she had poured into her sanctuary. She hoped that being surrounded by the beauty of nature would inspire him to share the burdens he had kept hidden for so long. As they worked side by side, she could feel the warmth of the sun on her back, the gentle rustling of leaves providing a soothing backdrop to their silence. The garden, a patchwork of colors, felt alive with possibilities. Elara tended to the flowers, her hands working the soil as she stole glances at Caleb. He knelt a few feet away, focused on his task but distant in spirit, lost in a world of his own. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over their activities. Elara decided to take a break, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. She poured herself a glass of cool water, offering it to Caleb, hoping that this small act of care might encourage him to open up. He accepted it gratefully but remained quiet, his gaze still fixed on the ground. Sighing softly, Elara turned her attention to the sky, watching as clouds began to gather on the horizon. The air felt charged, thickening with an impending storm, a fitting metaphor for the emotions swirling within her heart. She sensed that Caleb's walls were still firmly in place, and the thought made her heart ache. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Elara felt a rush of energy as the storm approached, the fresh scent of rain filling the air, invigorating her spirit. She loved the sound of raindrops on leaves, the way nature came alive in a storm, and she hoped that this tempest would somehow inspire Caleb to let go of his inner turmoil. "Let's go inside," she suggested silently, her eyes bright with anticipation as she gestured toward her cozy cottage nestled at the edge of the garden. Caleb nodded, and they quickly gathered their things, laughter bubbling up as they raced to the shelter of her home just as the skies opened up. Inside, the warmth enveloped them, contrasting the coolness of the storm outside. Elara moved to the window, her heart racing with excitement as she watched the rain dance on the earth, the droplets creating a symphony of sound. She turned back to Caleb, who stood by the door, a storm of emotions swirling in his eyes. The distance between them felt less tangible now, the intimacy of the moment drawing them closer. Elara took a deep breath, summoning her courage as she approached him. She reached out, gently touching his arm, a silent invitation for him to share what was weighing on his heart. The connection between them sparked with electricity, and for a moment, she felt hope bloom within her. But as quickly as the hope blossomed, it faded. Caleb looked away, his expression clouded with something she could not decipher. Elara's heart sank as she realized he was still wrestling with his fears, the storm within him far from quieted. She wanted to reach him, to help him see that he was not alone. But each time she tried, it felt as if the walls between them grew thicker. The rain continued to pour, the sound drowning out the silence that had fallen between them. Elara turned back to the window, watching as the world outside transformed into a watercolor painting, the colors running together in a beautiful chaos. It mirrored her own feelings, beautiful yet chaotic, a blend of longing and frustration. As the storm raged on, the winds howled outside, shaking the branches of the trees. The intensity of the weather felt like a reflection of the turmoil inside Caleb. She could see the tension etched on his face, the way he clenched his fists at his sides, as if holding back a tempest of his own. Elara wanted to scream, to shake him and demand that he let her in. But she understood that this was a battle he had to fight on his own terms. Suddenly, the storm peaked, the winds whipping around the cottage, and with it, a flash of lightning illuminated the room. Caleb jumped slightly, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. In that moment, Elara felt a pang of empathy. This storm was not just outside. It was within him, too. She moved closer, her heart racing as she sensed that this was the moment to take a risk. With a deep breath, she reached out again, this time placing both hands on his shoulders. He looked down at her, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. She searched his gaze, hoping to find a glimpse of the man she knew, the one capable of sharing his truth. In that silence, she tried to convey everything she felt, her love, her understanding, her unwavering support. She wanted him to know that it was okay to be vulnerable, that she would stand by him no matter what storms lay ahead. But Caleb's expression remained guarded, his heart still locked away. The rain continued to pour, and Elara felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She wanted to break through, to shatter the walls he had built around his heart. But as she stood there, holding on to him, she realized that she could not force him to share what he was not ready to reveal. As the storm outside began to ebb, the intensity of the rain lessening, Elara's resolve faltered. She stepped back, releasing her grip on his shoulders, feeling the loss of connection like a physical blow. The energy in the room shifted, the once vibrant atmosphere now heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. Caleb seemed to sense the change, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, and Elara felt the tears prick at her eyes. She fought against them, unwilling to let her emotions spill over. Instead, she turned back to the window, watching as the storm began to pass, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of blue sky. The rain fell softly now, a gentle reminder that even the fiercest storms eventually subside. Elara took a deep breath, grounding herself in the moment. She understood that she could not control Caleb's journey, nor could she rush him into opening up. All she could do was remain steadfast, a beacon of light amid the storm. In the days that followed, Elara made a conscious effort to create a space for Caleb that felt safe and welcoming. She continued to invite him into her world, hoping that gradually he would let his guard down. They spent time in the garden, where laughter mingled with the scents of flowers, and she made sure to keep the atmosphere light, allowing him to find comfort in their shared moments without the weight of expectation. Yet, even as she nurtured their bond, she felt the ache of his distance. The laughter they shared often masked the unspoken words that lingered just beneath the surface, and Elara found herself wondering if she would ever truly understand the depths of his heart. Each day felt like a delicate balance, a dance of emotions that could shift at any moment. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden hue across the meadow, Elara found herself drawn to the oak tree where they had spent so many beautiful moments. She decided to spend some time there alone, hoping that the tranquility of the space might offer her clarity. Sitting beneath the sprawling branches, she closed her eyes, allowing the sounds of nature to envelop her. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the gentle hum of life. It all calmed her racing heart. In that moment of stillness, she reflected on her journey with Caleb, the joy he had brought into her life, and the uncertainty that lingered like a shadow. Elara understood that love is not just about the moments of joy. It is also about the struggles and the storms. She felt a deep desire to be the anchor for Caleb, to help him navigate through the tempest within him. But she also knew that she could not carry the weight of his past for him. He had to confront it on his own. As she opened her eyes, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a breathtaking array of colors across the sky. The beauty of the moment reminded her of the resilience of life, of how even the darkest storms give way to the light. She felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Perhaps the storm within Caleb would eventually pass, just as the summer storm had. With renewed determination, Elara resolved to continue nurturing their relationship, to create a space where love could flourish despite the uncertainties. She would remain steadfast, a source of support and love, while allowing Caleb the freedom to unravel his own threads. That night, as she lay in bed, she envisioned a future filled with warmth and understanding. She dreamed of the day when Caleb would finally feel safe enough to share his truth, when they could stand together, united against whatever challenges lay ahead. And as the stars twinkled outside her window, Elara clung to that hope, knowing that love was worth every moment of waiting, every storm weathered, and every unspoken word. She would be there, waiting patiently, ready to embrace him when he was finally ready to step into the light. Chapter 15. The Breaking Dawn. As the summer days rolled on, the warm embrace of the sun seemed to mirror Elara's determination. The garden flourished under her care, each bloom a testament to her patience and love. Yet, as vibrant as the flowers were, a shadow lingered in her heart, an echo of the silence that hung between her and Caleb. One morning, after a particularly beautiful night filled with stars, Elara awoke with a sense of purpose. The golden rays of dawn poured through her window, illuminating her room and casting playful shadows on the walls. She knew that it was time to confront the distance that had been growing like a chasm between them. After a quick breakfast, Elara ventured into the garden, her heart racing with a mix of hope and anxiety. The flowers greeted her with their vibrant colors, but today, they felt like a backdrop to a more serious purpose. She decided to create a special space for Caleb, a haven that would invite him to share the burdens he carried. With renewed energy, Elara began to gather materials. She carefully arranged cushions and blankets beneath the grand oak tree, creating a cozy nook where they could sit together, away from the world. She decorated the area with wildflowers, their fragrances mingling in the soft breeze. Each detail was crafted with care, her heart imbued in every stitch, every petal. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Elara found herself glancing at the path leading to her garden, anticipation bubbling within her. She wanted this space to be a sanctuary for Caleb, a place where he could feel comfortable and safe enough to share the storms brewing in his heart. Finally, she heard the familiar crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Caleb appeared, his silhouette framed by the sunlit backdrop of the garden. Elara's heart leapt at the sight of him. He looked worn, as if he had been carrying a heavy weight, yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity. Elara waved him over, a smile blooming on her lips as she gestured to the cozy nook beneath the oak tree. She watched as he approached, his steps hesitant but drawn to the beauty she had created. He took a seat on one of the cushions, looking around at the colorful wildflowers, in the inviting space. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of nature enveloping them. Elara felt the weight of their unspoken words, but the atmosphere felt different today. The sun cast a warm glow over them, and she sensed a shift in the air, an opportunity for connection. Elara reached for a small wildflower and gently tucked it behind Caleb's ear, a simple gesture filled with affection. He blinked in surprise, his eyes widening slightly, and for a heartbeat, she felt the wall around him quiver. But as quickly as it began, the moment passed, and he looked away, a shadow crossing his face. Elara's heart sank, but she refused to be disheartened. She remained at his side, offering her presence, hoping that the tranquility of the garden would create an opening for him to express what he had been holding inside. She wanted him to know that it was okay to feel, to let the storms rage and then recede. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Elara decided to bring out some freshly baked bread and honey, a small comfort to share in the sanctuary she had created. She set the food before them, a simple meal that felt like an offering of peace and warmth. Caleb took a piece of bread, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing as he tasted the sweetness of the honey. They shared the quiet moment, the setting sun casting soft light over their faces. Elara watched him closely, hoping to see the flicker of emotions that had been buried for too long. But as the light shifted, she noticed that his gaze remained distant, as if he were gazing into the past rather than savoring the present. Elara's heart ached at the sight, the longing to reach him intensifying. She felt the weight of their silence, the air thick with everything left unsaid. Determined, Elara took a deep breath and leaned closer to him, her heart racing. She reached out, placing her hand over his, a small act of intimacy. The warmth of her touch spread through her, and she hoped it would reach him, melting away the walls he had built. Caleb turned to her, his eyes finally meeting hers. In that moment, she saw the flicker of vulnerability beneath the surface, a glimpse of the emotions he had kept hidden for so long. Elara held her breath, willing him to open up, to let her into the depths of his heart. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability was replaced by a cloud of uncertainty. He pulled his hand away, the gesture subtle but powerful, and the distance returned, wrapping around them like a shroud. Elara's heart sank, the ache of his withdrawal resonating deep within her. Despite the setback, Elara refused to give up. She moved to sit beside him, determined to create a space where he could feel safe. She pointed toward the horizon, where the sun was setting, casting golden rays across the sky. The beauty of the moment filled her with a renewed sense of hope. Caleb's gaze followed hers, and for the briefest moment, Elara saw something shift in him, a flicker of appreciation for the world around them. The vibrant colors of the sunset reflected the myriad of emotions within her, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, beauty could still thrive. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in deeper hues, Elara felt a stirring of emotions within her. She longed for Caleb to understand that she was there for him, ready to weather whatever storm lay ahead. She wished to convey that love was not merely about moments of joy, but also about navigating the shadows together. Suddenly, the winds began to pick up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree. A chill crept into the air, a reminder of the summer storms that had passed. Elara watched as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, a canvas filled with possibilities. In that moment, something shifted within Caleb. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing, as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap into the unknown. Elara's heart raced, and she sensed that this might be the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when he would finally let down his guard. But as the stars blinked overhead, Caleb took a deep breath and looked away again, retreating into the depths of his mind. Elara felt the crushing weight of disappointment settle in her chest, yet she refused to let it extinguish her hope. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the sky, focusing on the stars that shimmered above them, bright and unyielding. She realized that the night was a metaphor for their journey. Darkness could be overwhelming, but it also offered the opportunity for light to shine through. The evening deepened, and Elara remained by Caleb's side, the silence between them a testament to the struggle within. She felt the ebb and flow of emotions swirling around them, each unspoken word a thread woven into the fabric of their connection. As the moon rose high above, casting its silver glow over the garden, Elara took a deep breath. She understood that the path ahead would not be easy, but she was committed to standing by Caleb to be a steady light in the darkness. With that resolve, she leaned back against the oak tree, allowing herself to feel the coolness of the earth beneath her, the gentle whisper of the wind through the leaves. She hoped that, one day, Caleb would find the courage to share his truth, to embrace the love that awaited him. In the quiet of the night, Elara closed her eyes and surrendered to the moment. She understood that the storm within Caleb might not pass today or tomorrow, but she would be there, waiting patiently, ready to catch him when he fell. And as the stars twinkled overhead, she clung to the belief that love, when nurtured with patience and understanding, could ultimately break through even the darkest of storms. Chapter 16. The Quiet Awakening. The days turned into weeks, and the garden continued to thrive under Elara's tender care. Each morning, she awoke with renewed hope, determined to foster a sense of safety for Caleb in their shared sanctuary. Yet, as the sun rose and set each day, she could still feel the weight of his silence pressing down like a thick fog. Caleb came and went, often lost in thought, yet his presence brought a comforting rhythm to her days. They would sit together in the garden, sharing quiet moments, the sun casting dappled shadows around them. Though he rarely spoke, Elara found solace in the companionship they had cultivated, the gentle bond of two souls navigating an uncertain landscape. One afternoon, a soft breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the air, inviting Elara to contemplate the beauty surrounding her. She sat cross-legged on the grass, her fingers lightly tracing the petals of the flowers, each touch a reminder of the fragility and resilience of life. As she lost herself in the delicate beauty of nature, she sensed Caleb approaching. He settled down beside her, the familiar warmth radiating from his presence. For a moment, they simply existed together, the stillness speaking volumes. Elara took a deep breath, hoping that the peace of the garden might inspire him to open up. The sun began its descent, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The sky transformed into a canvas of oranges, pinks, and purples, a breathtaking display that drew Elara's attention. She looked toward Caleb, hoping to catch a glimpse of wonder in his eyes. But instead, she found him staring at the ground, a frown etched on his brow. Her heart ached at the sight, the sadness in his expression a stark reminder of the internal struggles he faced. She wished she could reach into his heart, to unravel the tangled threads of his thoughts and fears, and help him see that he was not alone. Elara gently picked a flower, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to Caleb's somber mood. She turned it over in her hands, contemplating how to bridge the gap between them. With a soft sigh, she placed the flower in his hand, a simple gesture filled with meaning. Caleb looked down at the flower, and for a brief moment, a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, crossed his face. But as quickly as it appeared, the shadow returned, and he clenched his fist around the flower, the petals crumpling under the pressure. Elara felt a pang of disappointment, but she quickly reminded herself of her purpose. She would not give up. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the garden, she made a decision. This was a pivotal moment. She would take a risk and show Caleb the depth of her feelings, hoping to create a pathway into his heart. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she gathered her courage. With careful steps, Elara moved to a small clearing near the edge of the garden, a place where the view of the sunset was unobstructed. She turned back to Caleb, her heart racing as she gestured for him to follow. He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his features, but eventually rose to his feet and walked over to her. The air between them felt charged with anticipation as they stood side by side, the vibrant colors of the sunset painting their faces in warm hues. Elara looked at the horizon, her heart swelling with hope. She took a deep breath, summoning the words that had been dancing on the tip of her tongue. In that moment, she wanted to convey everything she felt, the love, the longing, the desire to share the burdens that lay heavy on his heart. With the sun sinking lower, casting its final golden rays, she turned to Caleb. She took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. The gesture felt monumental, a connection that transcended words. She pointed toward the sun, which was slowly dipping below the horizon, the colors shifting into deeper shades of indigo and violet. Caleb's gaze followed hers, and for a heartbeat, Elara felt a flicker of hope. The beauty of the moment seemed to resonate with something deep within him, a glimpse of recognition flickering in his eyes. As the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, a sense of stillness enveloped them, the world around them fading into a quiet reverie. Elara turned to Caleb, her heart pounding in her chest, and squeezed his hand gently, willing him to understand that she was there for him, ready to share the burdens he carried. In that silence, she allowed herself to feel the emotions that had been building within her. She had been patient, she had been supportive, but she needed him to understand that love was not just about waiting. It was also about sharing the weight of the world together. As the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Elara took a deep breath. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the warmth of Caleb's hand in hers, the gentle pressure a reminder that they were connected. She envisioned a future where they could stand side by side, facing whatever challenges lay ahead together. But as she opened her eyes, she noticed a flicker of uncertainty return to Caleb's face. The tension in his shoulders returned, the guard around his heart reasserting itself. Elara's heart sank at the sight, but she remained steadfast, refusing to let despair take root. With her free hand, she reached for a small stone nearby, its smooth surface cool against her palm. She turned it over in her fingers, a physical representation of the beauty that could emerge from the rough edges of life. She held it out to Caleb, a silent invitation to accept the imperfect moments that made up their journey. He glanced at the stone, his expression unreadable, and Elara felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. The weight of his silence pressed down again, and she sensed that this was another turning point. She was teetering on the edge of a breakthrough, but she also understood that this moment was about him, his journey, his choices. As the stars twinkled overhead, the night deepening around them, Elara released the stone, letting it fall to the ground. The gentle thud echoed in the stillness, a reminder that even the smallest moments could hold significance. She squeezed Caleb's hand again, willing him to feel her support, her love, the understanding that she would be there, no matter how long it took. Time seemed to stretch in the quiet night. The world around them hushed as if holding its breath. Elara focused on Caleb, searching for any signs of the emotions that lay beneath the surface. She wanted so desperately for him to understand that vulnerability could be a strength, not a weakness. But as the moments ticked by, she felt the tension return, the silence wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Caleb's gaze remained fixed on the ground, and Elara realized that this was a journey he had to take on his own terms. As the moon rose higher, casting a soft glow over the garden, Elara felt a sense of resignation wash over her. She would not force him to open up. All she could do was remain present, a constant in the shifting tides of his emotions. She took a step back, releasing his hand, but not the hope that still lingered in her heart. They stood together in the dim light, the connection between them still palpable, even in silence. Elara closed her eyes, allowing the serenity of the moment to wash over her. She would trust that, eventually, Caleb would find his way through the storm, that the love they shared would light the path ahead. As the night deepened, Elara made a silent promise to herself. She would be patient, she would be understanding, and above all, she would continue to nurture the bond they had created. And as she opened her eyes to the vastness of the night sky, she held on to the belief that even in the darkest hours, love would ultimately guide them home. Chapter 17. The Embrace of Tomorrow. As dawn broke over the horizon, the soft light crept into the garden, painting the petals of the flowers in hues of gold and blush. Elara awoke with a sense of clarity, the events of the past weeks crystallizing in her mind. The silence that had once felt heavy now seemed to carry a promise, an unspoken understanding that change was possible. Elara rose from her bed, her heart brimming with a quiet determination. Today was a new day, and she felt a stirring of hope, a sense that the time had come for Caleb to step into the light. She moved through the garden, taking in the vibrant colors and the scents of the blooms, each one a testament to the resilience of nature, much like her own heart. After tending to the flowers, Elara prepared a simple breakfast, the aroma of fresh bread mingling with the sweetness of ripe fruits. She set the table under the grand oak tree, a familiar spot that had witnessed so many of their silent moments together. The air was warm, the gentle breeze carrying whispers of the coming day. As she placed the last piece of fruit on the table, she caught sight of Caleb emerging from the path, his figure framed against the morning light. He looked different today. There was a softness in his eyes, a hint of something that felt lighter, as if the weight of the world had begun to lift from his shoulders. Elara's heart raced at the sight, her hopes igniting like the early sun. She gestured toward the breakfast spread, her smile warm and inviting. Caleb approached slowly, his expression contemplative but not burdened. He took a seat at the table, the tension in his posture easing as he took in the beautiful arrangement before him. As they shared breakfast, Elara felt an unspoken connection between them, a gentle acknowledgement of the journey they had traveled together. Caleb savored each bite, and Elara watched him closely, noticing how he lingered over the flavors, his eyes brightening with every taste. The morning unfolded peacefully, the sounds of nature harmonizing with the quiet exchange of glances between them. Elara felt a growing sense of optimism. The silence that had once felt like a barrier now seemed to hum with potential. After breakfast, Elara suggested a walk through the garden, and they strolled side by side, the earth cool beneath their feet. She pointed out the various blooms, their petals glistening with dew, each one a symbol of growth and renewal. Caleb listened, a small smile playing on his lips as he took in the beauty around them. As they reached the far end of the garden, they came upon a small pond, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky. Elara knelt by the water, her fingers tracing the delicate ripples as she watched tiny fish dart beneath the surface. The tranquility of the scene enveloped them, and she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. Caleb joined her at the pond, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. Elara felt the energy between them crackle, a tension that both excited and terrified her. It was a moment suspended in time, the world around them fading as they stood together at the edge of a new beginning. Elara turned to face Caleb, her heart pounding with the weight of unspoken emotions. She wanted to convey the depth of her feelings, the love that had grown quietly between them, nurturing itself in the fertile soil of understanding and patience. With a gentle gesture, she reached for his hand, her touch light but firm. Caleb looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if seeking permission to venture deeper. In that moment, Elara felt the barrier between them begin to dissolve, a promise that the silence could no longer contain the emotions that lay beneath. She squeezed his hand, willing him to take a leap of faith. The connection between them sparked like a flame, igniting a warmth that radiated through her entire being. She could feel Caleb's heartbeat quicken, the air thick with anticipation as they stood on the precipice of something profound. In the soft light of the morning, Caleb finally turned to her fully, the weight of his silence lifting. He took a deep breath, and Elara saw something shift within him, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the facade. It was as if he were finally ready to share the burdens he had been carrying for so long. Without uttering a single word, Elara moved closer, her heart urging her to embrace the moment. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his, an intimate gesture that transcended the need for words. In that brief contact, she felt his breath against her skin, the warmth of his presence igniting a connection that had been waiting to flourish. The world around them faded into the background as they stood locked in that gentle embrace. Elara felt the tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of release, of finally reaching a point where their hearts could meet without fear. As they pulled back slightly, Caleb's eyes held hers, and she felt a tidal wave of emotions wash over them. There was still a lingering uncertainty, but it was accompanied by a glimmer of hope. She knew that he was ready to take the next step, to confront the shadows that had haunted him. With newfound courage, Caleb raised his hand, brushing a stray lock of hair behind Elara's ear, his fingers grazing her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture sent shivers down her spine, and she felt the walls he had built begin to crumble, the space between them transforming into something sacred. In that moment, the weight of the past fell away, leaving only the present, their shared connection, the beauty of the garden surrounding them, and the promise of what lay ahead. Elara leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with the understanding that love could indeed flourish in the light of vulnerability. Together, they stood by the pond, the ripples of their shared journey creating a tapestry of hope and healing. Elara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of Caleb's presence envelop her, feeling a sense of completeness wash over her. She knew that they were at the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise and possibility. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden rays across the landscape, Elara opened her eyes to the beauty around them. She turned back to Caleb, and in that moment, the world felt alive with potential. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, hand in hand, hearts open and ready to embrace the journey. With a gentle smile, Elara squeezed his hand again, the warmth of their connection echoing in the depths of her heart. They had weathered storms, endured silence, and navigated the complexities of love. But now they stood together at the threshold of something beautiful. Caleb returned her smile, and in that exchange, Elara felt the warmth of 1,000 unsaid words. Their journey was far from over, but the path ahead felt brighter than ever, illuminated by the love that had blossomed in the quiet spaces of their hearts. As they walked back toward the heart of the garden, the sun shining down upon them, Elara knew that they were ready to embrace whatever came next. Together, they would weave their story into the fabric of time, a testament to the power of love and the beauty of vulnerability. And as the flowers danced in the gentle breeze, Elara held onto the belief that love, when nurtured with patience and understanding, could transcend any darkness, guiding them both toward a future filled with light, joy, and the promise of tomorrow.